I am so scared, I don't know what to do. To start with, let me just say I loved my wife, Serena. I loved her for nearly 12 years, but 2 years ago we grew apart, and in that time, I met someone else. Katie walked into my life on a particularly cold February day, with her long dark hair and her beautiful green eyes. She was new at the office where I worked as a computer engineer. I think it was her laugh that really did it for me. That proper throw your head back, really means it kind of laugh, you know? We started meeting up in the cafe downstairs for lunch, at first accidentally and then all the time. We had so much in common. We loved the same PC games. We both enjoyed action movies and true crime, and we both came from big families. Katie was a widow and had lost her husband young. There was a vulnerability to her that I wanted to protect. I grew obsessed with spending every spare moment with her. Truly, I should have felt more guilty. But I didn't. Serena, my petite blonde, no-nonsense wife, could not be more different from Katie, and she really didn't feel like the woman I married anymore. She was so distant and cold now. I can't even remember why she changed and what happened, I just knew that my marriage was over. When Katie and I kissed that time at the office Christmas party and a colleague saw us, I knew that it was time I told my wife everything. But when I finally worked up the courage to tell her that evening on the walk home, steeling myself for a terrible confrontation, I found Serena sitting at the kitchen table, her face in her hands, weeping over an open letter. I asked her what was wrong and she simply gestured to the letter. I lifted it up to read it and my mouth went dry. Breast cancer. Stage 3. I couldn't tell my wife I was leaving her now. It would utterly destroy her. So I did what I had to do. I told Katie about Serena's diagnosis and she was heartbroken but understanding when I told her that we needed to break up. I supported Serena through immunotherapy and took over all cooking duties and cleaning duties. We ate the healthiest of meals, and I tried my very best to be the most supportive husband I could be, but cancer was rough on Serena. She lost the spark in her eyes and grew gaunt, unable to keep any of the food down. When we returned to the doctor, he told us she was now at stage 4. This meant a course of deeply aggressive chemo. That night, I held Serena as she sobbed and told me she wasn't sure she would make it through this. And then she asked me to help her die. I was stunned, unable to believe I had heard her right. I'll never forget how she lifted her now gaunt face, looked me in the eyes and said, "Daniel, I want you to help me die. Please." I was horrified. I can't do that. I told her, the words barely making sense. I was so gobsmacked. But she pleaded and pleaded. Finally, we made a pact. That if the cancer became too much for her to handle, I would give her the entire bottle of sleeping pills the doctor had assigned for her crushed up in her favorite ice cream. Even now, I feel numb just thinking about it. Serena, however, knew exactly what she wanted and seemed very sure about it. 2 weeks went by without us talking about it again, but honestly, fuck cancer. I have never watched a healthy human being deteriorate so fast. Finally, when the doctor told us that the cancer had metastasized and moved to her lungs, she asked me to do the deed. So last night, I bought her favorite ice cream and numbly crushed the pills up. Then I carried it up to her. She ate the ice cream slowly. My brave, clever wife, who I had not appreciated in time, was the most dignified woman when it came to death. Quietly, she smiled, thanked me and closed her eyes for the last time. I waited until the rattle in her chest stopped. And her breathing slowed to a halt. She looked peaceful for the first time in a long, long time. I knew she was gone. I walked downstairs to the living room and sat down on the sofa. Then I bawled my eyes out like a small child. This morning, I awoke still on the couch, a dull, cold realization of what had happened the previous night. But then I smelled coffee and bacon. I heard the sound system in the kitchen blasting with a cheerful pop song. What the fuck? I was immediately on my feet and I headed into the kitchen, heart racing. And there, happily humming to herself, was Serena. Not the Serena I left upstairs. Gaunt and hollowed out by illness. But my Serena. The Serena of before. She smiled at me in a way she hadn't for years. "Morning, my darling. Here we go, bacon and eggs sunny side up." She pushed a plate on the kitchen island in my direction and placed a cup of coffee before me. What the ever-loving fuck was going on? I watched my dead wife cook up a storm and act like everything was completely fine. Like she hadn't died last night. Serena, what? She lifted her cup of coffee and took a big sip, eyes closing as though it was the most delicious thing she had ever tasted. I know, my love. She said, I would be surprised too. You died last night. I stated the obvious, I know, but it was also the truth. She had been dead. She nodded. Yes, yes, I know. And I was very dead. But that had to happen, you see, because how else would I come back to life? I did not like the sound of her bright voice suddenly. Something in the air felt off. Something about all of this felt like the kind of decay you cannot see, just under a gleaming surface. Don't you see, darling, she told me casually, taking a bite of her toast. I fell in love. I had to stay. This hit me like a ton of bricks and made me take a step back. You what? Now, Daniel. She said, wagging the piece of toast at me, you aren't the only one who is allowed to have fun. I thought this was a marriage of equals? My voice was now hoarse, even to my own ears. I don't know what you're... Don't fucking lie to me. She suddenly shouted, throwing her plate at me. I ducked just in time and flinched as it shattered. Serena, please calm down. I was trying so hard to keep my composure, but it was getting harder and harder as I watched her. It struck me then that her movements were very odd. Sudden and strange. It clicked into place when she reached for her coffee again. It was like this was the first time she was wearing her body. I took a step back. What is going on here? I could hear the tremors of fear in my voice. What's going on, Daniel, is that I know about your tawdry little affair. In fact, she smiled, horribly, a bit too wide. I have known since the beginning. So I prayed to the darkness. I prayed to any terrible thing that was listening, and that was when he came to me. My own god of pain. Her voice, which had been serene as so far, began to shift a little. Something about it felt like it was cracking. And then I heard it. A slow inhuman growl escaped her throat. Her eyes bulged. Don't you want to meet him, Daniel? The love of my life. Her skin looked like it was ripping at the seams. Her mouth split open and a huge tongue and fangs fell out. He really wants to meet you? Before I could scream, shout, run, anything, the thing that was wearing my wife's skin had filled our kitchen. It was at least 7 feet tall, its mouth more like a gash, too many fangs and that too long tongue. Its body, oh God, its body was that of a rotting old man, buried long enough ago that the vile smell of decay filled the room. Its eyes were voids. Nothing inside them but eternal darkness. And the most terrifying thing of all was that it was looking at me, and grinning. I stumbled backward, turning to run, but before I could, the thing reached out and grasped my left arm. I tried to snatch my arm back, but before I could, I felt a sharp pain, like my arm was on fire, and when I looked down, it was my arm. My arm looked like it belonged to an old man. It had withered with just a single touch from that thing. I wrenched my arm out of its grip and ran to the door, only to find it locked. I pounded it on it, hoping, praying the neighbors, someone would hear me. It was morning and someone would. I heard the cold, low chuckle behind me and my blood froze. Without even thinking, I turned and ran past it for the stairs. I could hear its slow shuddering footsteps behind me as I rushed up the stairs to the bedroom, throwing myself inside. Quickly I locked the door behind me and then ran to the window to get out. It didn't budge, so I tried to throw a chair against the window. It wouldn't break. A soft, persistent knocking began on the door. I threw myself against the glass of the window and started banging on it. Downstairs my neighbor Greg was mowing his lawn. I shouted his name as loudly as I could, and for a second he looked up. Relief flooded through me as I screamed, "Help me!" But Greg just frowned up as though he couldn't see me. I screamed louder, "Greg!" as the knocking grew more persistent. "Help me!" But he had already looked away and was back to mowing his lawn. I bashed those windows and yelled until my throat grew hoarse, and finally, my knees gave way and I slumped to the floor. I've been here ever since. The day is slowly turning to twilight. Outside, the thing keeps knocking on the door. I can hear it shuffling softly back and forth. A voice that was once my wife's but is now rotting and decayed filters into this slowly darkening bedroom. "Daniel, won't you come out and play?" The door is locked and the gaps are plugged with towels, but I don't think it will make any difference. I can hear my neighbors driving by outside the barricaded window, completely unaware of the horrors taking place inside this house. I guess I just want someone else to know the truth. It started as these things often do, with something completely unexpected. An event that came screeching in out of the dark to smash the quiet life that I'd built with my wife Alice and our son, Jake. We tried so hard to child-proof our house. We protected the power outlets, used baby gates, and stored dangerous chemicals far out of reach. I don't know where Jake got a hold of that small glass bead. Maybe he even found it outside, in the street or at the playground. All I know is, the moment he swallowed it, that little ball of glass cut off his air supply completely. Alice and I tried desperately to remember the Heimlich maneuver and perform it on our squirming, crying, purple-faced child. But we only made things worse. By the time the EMTs arrived, Jake had stopped breathing. He lay in my wife's arms, limp and lifeless as a rag doll, drool dribbling out of his bluish lips. The looks on the paramedics' faces, when they finally arrived, told us everything we needed to know. Despite their best resuscitation efforts, our son was gone. I still remember the way my wife's hot tears soaked through my shirt as we walked out to the ambulance with Jake. I wanted to hold his tiny hand until the last minute, until they loaded him into that sterile metal box and the doors closed on him forever. Then, suddenly Jake grabbed my finger. His eyes snapped open, and with a pop, the cat's eye bead popped out of his mouth. The paramedics couldn't believe it. Resuscitation efforts had ended 8 minutes ago, and Jake had been legally dead for almost half an hour. Lazarus syndrome, they called it, but I didn't care about names or diagnosis. I didn't care about tests and trials and clinical statistics. I was just happy to have my son back. Jake was quieter than I remembered. Before, his big blue eyes had sparkled like sunlight on the sea. Now, however, they seemed darker, deeper, somehow like I was looking into a still, bottomless pool. I found that I couldn't maintain eye contact with him for long. Maybe that was the first sign. Maybe that's when I should have acted. But it's too late now. Like most new parents, Alice and I had been terrified to leave Jake's side at first. We kept his crib in our bedroom, but after his recovery, we found we couldn't sleep with Jake nearby. He would stand and stare at us all night, his hands grabbing the bars of his crib like a death row in mating teddy bear pajamas. Although Alice and I never talked about it, we could both feel his gaze probing at the back of our skulls, as though he were trying to drill them open and let something in. A few weeks later, we moved Jake's crib to my office. That's why we were so terrified to find him in bed with us at 3 a.m. the next night. He lay sucking his thumb with one hand, and had the other on Alice's hip in a way that seemed strangely adult and possessive. Worse still, when I looked at that hand out of the corner of my eye, it didn't seem like a toddler's arm at all. It looked stretched, hairy, and horrible. While I carried my sleeping son back to his crib, I wondered if I was having some kind of psychological reaction to the trauma of Jake's death and unexpected resuscitation. That could be the only explanation for the things I was seeing and feeling. Right? As I put Jake back in his crib, I noticed something red on his lip. With awful, adult intelligence, he quickly tried to hide it from me, but I spun him back around. Jake opened his mouth wide. A waterfall of blood poured out. I'd never seen so much in my life. I screamed for Alice and looked around for something, anything, to stop the bleeding. Behind me, I could hear the gory stream splattering on the floor. And that wasn't all. When I turned again, hundreds of round cat's eye beads were dribbling from my son's mouth. "What?" Alice burst into the room with a shout. I pointed to Jake. But he was fine. Our son sat sleepily in his crib with a puzzled expression on his face, as though he was concerned about my weird behavior. I tried to stammer an explanation to Alice on our walk back to bed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that my son was laughing silently at me behind my back. From there, things only got worse. The next night, I woke from a revolting dream in which a giant leech was writhing around inside my sheets, sucking me dry. And just like in the dream, there was a weight on my chest when I woke. It was Jake, giggling as he crawled around our bed. It was all I could do to keep myself from shoving him off me. "This is your son," I told myself. "You love him." And it was true. But more and more I was starting to wonder whether the thing inside the crib was really Jake at all. I installed a bolt on Jake's bedroom door, surely that would stop his late-night wanderings. But the next night, my son was back in bed with us again. I placed a motion-activated camera in the hallway, hoping to figure out how on earth Jake had opened the bolt. And what I saw in that eerie night vision footage will haunt me for the rest of my life. Something slid beneath my son's door. A hand. At first, it looked just like Jake's, but as the arm stretched upwards toward the lock and the fingers extended, its appearance changed into something monstrous. My son's arm had somehow passed beneath that door, reached all the way up its length, and unbolted its lock with clawed, hairy fingers. The hideous arm retracted. The door creaked open. And Jake crawled along the ceiling toward our bedroom. The last still image the camera captured was Jake's freakishly extended foot and snarling face as he kicked it away. I watched the clip again and again, unable to reconcile what I'd seen with the toddler dozing peacefully just a few feet away. During the day, Jake was completely normal. He threw tantrums, colored and played with his toys, asked a question every 5 seconds, and fell asleep eating his Cheerios. Maybe it was just at night when A sudden thump jolted me out of my reverie. Jake was awake. In fact, he was standing right next to me, a lifeless expression on his face. He just slammed his little fist into my computer. Right above the port where I'd inserted the camera's SD card. Was he trying to destroy the video? Thump. Thump. Jake brought his fist down 2 more times with impossible strength, shattering my laptop's fragile plastic covering and the SD card inside. And that wasn't all. My mind didn't want to process it, couldn't process it. But Jake had grown taller than me. I looked down in horror at the extra 40 inches of deformed flesh that started at my son's pajama bottoms and ended in the clawed feet on the floor. I shut my eyes and clamped down a scream. When I opened them again, Jake was crawling on the rug, completely fixated on the toy truck in front of him. His face and body were completely normal. But my laptop was a broken mess. Jake, or whatever was inside of him, was getting more powerful. Alice and I felt hunted inside our own home. Whenever we tried to discuss what was happening to Jake, we'd hear his tiny feet scurrying impossibly fast, and suddenly he'd be standing right beside us. Listening. Watching with those dark blue, endlessly deep eyes. After what happened last night, I suppose I can't blame Alice for leaving. I'd spent the day installing a key-operated lock on Jake's bedroom door. I set up a baby camera in the room that streamed live to Alice and I. In case he needs us, I told myself. But the truth was that I'd set it up for our own protection. If Jake started to change, we'd know about it. The new setup was supposed to help us sleep, but in the end, Alice and I just lay awake watching what was happening on the other side of the baby camera. We stared at our perfectly ordinary, snoozing, thumb-sucking toddler as though we were watching a tense scene in a horror movie, the kind so terrifying that it's impossible to look away. We'd gone without sleep for so long, I suppose it was just a matter of time. I couldn't blame Alice when she dozed off on my shoulder. I kept nodding off as well. I tried to tell myself that one of us needed to keep watch. But every time I looked up, the scene on the screen was unchanged, the small, cute shape of Jake in his onesie pajamas, one arm around his teddy bear. Maybe things are fine now, the treacherous, exhausted part of my mind whispered. Maybe the danger, or whatever it was, has passed. My chin hit my chest, my eyes popped open with a start. A dark shape, probably Jake's teddy bear, lay in front of the camera, blocking it. And where was our son? MMMPH.MMMPPPHHH. At first, I didn't notice the sounds coming from beside me. I turned slowly, almost not wanting to see, and saw Jake's monstrous fingers toying with my wife's hair. His open mouth was pressed against hers, and something bulky and hideous was sliding down her throat. Although whether Jake was draining something out of Alice or infesting her with something of his own, I couldn't tell. My whole world became that horrible strangled sound, those two entangled figures lit only by the eerie green glow of the screen, and my own paralyzing fear. Alice's hands struggled feebly, trying to pry Jake off her face. It was only then that I found the strength to act. I grabbed Jake from behind and pulled. It took both of our combined strength to pry him, screeching and flailing, off of Alice's face. Both of their mouths were covered with a lipstick smear coating of bright red blood. Alice coughed and spit something up, A tiger's eyeglass bead. She stared at it for a long second, then grabbed her purse and walked out the door. I could hear Jake giggling beside me as Alice started her car in the misty 4 a.m. darkness. Even then, I knew in my heart that I'd never see her again. I've been home alone with Jake since then. He's been testing the boundaries, changing more often and more obviously. I think he knows that no help is coming for me. I can hear him running through the house, laughing, smashing things for fun. It's only a matter of time now. I'm not afraid of death. The moment Alice left, I accepted my fate. No, what I'm afraid of is, what if death is not the end? What if, after whatever Jake does to me, I wake up again, and spit a tiger's eyeball of glass out onto the floor? What if I wake up as something else? xwww.reddit.com web link